Good evening, everybody. Or good morning, good afternoon, whatever the time may be when you're listening to this. Today I have been learning about Boudica. She is certainly a fearsome Celtic queen, but her history is quite mysterious. There doesn't seem to be much physical or archaeological evidence that she even existed. In fact, the majority of what we know about Boudica is taken from the writings of Tacitus and Cassius Dio. Tacitus lived from 56 AD to 120 AD, and Cassius Dio lived from 155 AD to 235 AD, whereas Boudica lived from 25 or 30 AD, depending on the source you look at, to either 60 or 61 AD, which would mean she died at the age of 31 to 36. So Tacitus and Boudica actually did live in the same period, whereas Cassius Dio lived approximately 100 years later. When I talk about place names during this podcast, I'm going to use the modern day names as opposed to what they were called back then, purely because they are much easier to pronounce, and no other reason. And so we're going to start with the Iceni tribe. The Iceni were a tribe that occupied the area, which is now known as Norfolk, as well as parts of Suffolk and Cambridgeshire. In 43 AD, the Roman Emperor Claudius conducted his conquest of Britain, and the Iceni tribe initially allied with Rome during this conquest, and they were led by King Prasutagus. I think that's how you pronounce it, Prasutagus or Prasutagus, and he may have been installed as king in either 43 AD or 47 AD, depending which source you look at. As an ally of Rome, the Iceni were allowed to remain nominally independent. Prasutagus actually named Claudius co-heir to his kingdom. Tacitus states that when he died, referring to King Prasutagus, the Romans ignored the deal that they had made and the king's wishes to leave the kingdom to his daughters, and they took over completely. They deprived the Iceni of all their land and belongings. Any debts that were outstanding were immediately collected, and it was just a general mistreatment of the alliance that they had made. Now, Boudica was King Prasutagus' wife, and therefore the queen. So when the Romans took over, Boudica obviously objected to their encroachment, and so they lashed and whipped, which I believe is known as flogged, or was known as flogged, and just generally beat Boudica, and they even raped her daughters. Now this is obviously going to piss her off, and understandably so, and it was the combination of all these factors which led to the revolt of the Iceni in either 60 or 61 AD. Cassius Dio describes Boudica as a tall woman with reddish-brown hair that hung down to her hips. She wore a multicolored tunic with a heavy cloak and a bronze brooch, which, as far as I can see and tell, was typical royal attire for back then. The interesting thing is that she wore a golden torque around her neck. Now, the torque is a Celtic piece of jewelry that symbolizes a warrior's readiness to shed blood for the good of their people. And the interesting thing about it is that it was typically never worn by women and only men. Now, I'm not quite sure how true this is, but when I was doing my research, I did see a number, and the army that she had control over when she led her rebellion apparently accommodated 100,000 Celts, which is a huge amount of people. Again, I'm not quite sure how true that is, but that's a number I saw. So she took her army of 100,000 Celts, if that is correct, and began her rebellion in Colchester, or what's currently known as Colchester. In Colchester, she drove out the Romans completely and burned the city down to its ashes. After doing this, she moved her army to what's now known as London, in which she massacred 25,000 of its inhabitants and again burned the city down to its ashes. And after London, she then moved to St. Albans and did exactly the same thing. Both Cassius Dio and Tacitus explain that these attacks were horrifically violent, and Cassius Dio states that the women had their breasts cut off or hacked off, which is even worse, and then sewn into their mouths, like sewn into their mouths. And apparently they were then skewered full length on long poles and placed as if they were some kind of museum display. He also mentions mass execution, religious sacrifices, and indescribable slaughter. And Tacitus also mentions the sexual and religious violence that was conducted by Boudica and her daughters. Boudica's religion is believed to have been Druidic. It is said that before she would lead her troops into battle, she would invoke the British goddess of victory, Andraste. She would then open up the folds of her cloak and release a hare, and depending on which direction the hare ran, either towards the Romans or towards Boudica and her army, that is what they believed decided the fate of the battle, and which side was ultimately going to emerge victorious. And when the hare ran towards Boudica and her army, everybody cheered, and Boudica would then lift her hand to the heavens and praise Andraste. These actions are what historians believe to be the root of Druidic training. Okay, so back to the battles. Two of the largest towns in Roman Britain now lay in ashes, burned down, massacred. And according to Tacitus, around 70,000 Romans and allies had now been killed, although I did see reports that these numbers may have been greatly exaggerated. So after demolishing these three towns and cities, that is Colchester, London, and St. Albans, she moved her army to somewhere in the West Midlands, which is quite a distance away. And it's here she met the Roman general Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, and one way or another she met her unfortunate death. The battle took place on a major trading route known as Watling Street, which is actually, fun fact, not that far away from where I currently live. I found it quite fascinating how this immense historical battle took place so close to where I currently reside. But anyway, the Roman general defeated Boudica and ended the rebellion. Boudica's cause of death is completely different between Tacitus and Cassius Dio's writings. Tacitus states that Boudica poisoned herself to avoid capture and torture, whereas Cassius Dio states that she fell ill and died, and shortly afterwards was given a glorious funeral. Either way, she's a bad bitch and somebody who I've been interested in learning about since I initially was made aware of her in primary school many moons ago. And that's all I have on the history of Boudica, because again, we don't know much about her. But I have two fun facts which I can share with you before I leave. One of which is there is a statue of Boudica on a chariot wielding a sword called Boudica and Her Daughters. It can be seen in London on the north bank of the Thames by Westminster Bridge and was commissioned in 1905. Second fun fact is the only physical evidence for Boudica are on coins that relate to her husband, Prothodagus, and the geographical layer of burnt ash in the cities that she attacked. So that's it. That's the end of the podcast. It was a short one, but it is the first of potentially a few. There could be more in the future, but maybe not. Thank you all for listening. I hope you have a wonderful day, a wonderful night, or a wonderful evening, afternoon, whatever it may be. Thank you for listening. Good night.